in Israel. And since my memory isn't all that reliable at my advanced age, I brought some notes. Florence was born in Indiana in 1860. She died in Dayton, Ohio in 1938 at the age of 77 years and some months. And she's buried at Mount Zion Cemetery in Beaver Creek. Her father was Samuel Stewart, and during the Civil War, he was in the cavalry. And one of the favorite stories she used to tell was about her father, who was on his horse crossing a bridge when someone shot the horse, and both the horse and the rider fell into a ravine. And unfortunately, the horse landed on her father and injured his hip severely. So he remained under the bridge, hiding until darkness, and then he crawled to a cabin in a field nearby and stayed there through the next day until eventually he was, after a long time, able to make his way back to his troops in the army. But in the meantime, he was listed as missing in action, and her mother received the dreaded card with the black border, or it might have been a telegram, saying that he was missing and presumed killed in action. Then, some months later, Grandma said she woke up during the middle of the night. There was a light shining in her face, and she looked up and she saw her father, and she thought he was a ghost. But actually, he'd been in an army hospital somewhere, and evidently they had failed to notify the family that he was found and alive, and they didn't know about it until he came home. After that time, he was appointed the United States Marshal by Abraham Lincoln, and he served there for some months afterwards. Well, thank you, Lori. Another one of Grandma's stories was about going to Bringhurst when she was a young girl to see a stage show, which evidently was a big thing. There was a man who had this amazing talking parrot, and he was going to give a performance. But Grandma said they all got into the auditorium and sat, and the bird happened to see a man in the audience whom he recognized, and the only thing the bird would say was, "Mr. Church, Mr. Church," who was the name of the man. At school, Grandma was a good student, and she said she was often the champion spelling bee winner. Her mother died when the youngest sister, Susie, was a toddler, and the mother's dying wish to Grandma was that she should take care of Susie. There were some well-to-do neighbors in the neighborhood who wanted to adopt Susie, and at first Grandma thought it was a good thing because they would be able to give her a very good home and probably give her a lot more things than Grandma and Israel could have done for her. So the neighbors came to collect Susie, but in the meantime Grandma's conscience troubled her, and she had to tell them that she couldn't let Susie go. So Susie grew up and married Eli, and probably some of your family know more about her than I do. Grandma had a song she used to sing to the boys in the family. I don't remember the tune at all, but the verse was, "Hirsch, Hirsch," that was Indiana for hush. "Be as quiet as a mouse. There's a baby in this house, not a dolly, not a toy, but a great big bouncing boy." I never once heard my grandma swear. She was very straight-laced. But when she was really exasperated, she would say, "Plague on the luck," or "Consarn it." She was a great believer in signs and omens. She said her mother used to be in contact with the spirits and would hear them rapping on the headboard of her bed at night. But Grandma told about this vision that she had some years before her children were even grown. And she saw a chariot of fire come down from heaven, and carry off Floyd and Lulu. And the strange thing is that those two children were the only ones that I know of who preceded her in death. Grandpa was born in Indiana in 1853, and he died in Dayton, Ohio in 1944 at the age of 91. Marion was with him. I'd gone down into the basement to see if I could poke up the fire because this was in the middle of the night. And when I came back upstairs, he was gone. So Marion was with him for that. He worked on his father's farm when he was a young boy and as a young man. He was very, very strong. Aunt Grace said that when her brothers were growing up, and even when they were grown men, they liked to wrestle with Grandpa to see if they could take him down, and no one ever could. As a boy, he lived in a log cabin. And he said that in the winter, the snow would blow in through the chinks in the logs and would cover his bed with snow. And there were still some Indians living in the woods in Indiana at that time, and wild animals too. One of his stories was of a trip he'd made somewhere, and he had to come home in the darkness through the woods. He was conscious of something following him, so he hurried until he came to a little clearing and went across and then hid and looked back. He wasn't sure what he was going to see, but he was greatly relieved when it was just an old mule. Sometime in the 1890s, Grandma and Grandpa decided to move to Tennessee. They packed up and set off in a covered wagon. One night, they had to fight off some robbers who were attempting to steal their horses. They reached Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and the people there persuaded them to stay. So they settled on a farm that was owned by a man who was a judge in Elizabethtown. The farm was known as Blue Fountain Farm. And I believe that Aunt Grace and my mother were the two who were born there. Then later on, they moved to Louisville. And after that, probably in the early 1900s, they went to Cincinnati. Aunt Grace used to tell about going up to Cincinnati overnight on a riverboat when they moved. When my parents moved to Dayton in 1926, they asked Grandma and Grandpa to come with them. And they did, and we all lived together as long as they lived.
Thank you, Aunt Jenny. Very interesting stuff, and it made me think of a story you told me not too long ago when we were visiting, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but I love this story. And it had to do with Florence's sister, Susie, when she died prematurely. She was 26.
I'm not really sure.
I think we have discovered that. Yes, because he knows about that. She died at 26 of typhoid and had quite a few children. How many, Herman, did she have?
Well, there was 6 boys and a daughter, and I think a couple stillborns. I'm not sure.
So a bunch of kids, needless to say. Overwhelming, daunting task for this widower.
Yes.
So I think it was decided that the children needed to be parceled out to any family members attending this funeral. And there was one in particular who was less popular than the others with the family members. I believe that would be Roy? Or Aura. Okay, Aura. Well, because it was wintertime, I believe, it was very difficult for Florence to get to this funeral, and she got there rather late. And at that point, there was just one left. And guess who it was? And so when this person who was parceling out the children saw Florence coming for him, he rather apologetically said, well, we just have Aura left, sorry about that. And in the true Shire spirit, she said, well, if I had my pick of all the children of Susan's and Eli's, it would have been Aura. And I think that's just so wonderful. And he liked it so much there, I think he conned his brother into coming to join him. And so Roy as well, left wherever he was and came to live with Florence and Israel Shire. And so, as if 9 kids weren't enough for them to handle, they had these 2 nephews as well who grew up with my grandmother and her siblings. So anyway, and I know you told me a funny story about the funeral. You saw the funeral parlor guy who actually helped with this mortician, right? Is still around, or was when you went up there. I mean, this was 2 weeks ago, and he's pretty old, so we're not sure if he's still with us or not. But it was a cold day, and there was a steep hill to have to climb, and he remembered helping with this funeral, and it was slippery, and they dropped the casket, and the handle broke off, and he remembered. But there's no stone to mark her grave right now, but we know where the stones are that surround it, so we think we know pretty well where it is, and it is in
Logansport at the 9th Street
in
Cemetery.
Logansport at the 9th Street Cemetery. If anybody wants to go, we have pictures. So anyway, anybody else want to add anything?